Siva Vaidhyanathan, Jeff Jarvis wrote a book called What Would Google Do, which I think saw Google as the epitome of the new media company, and that we should look at it in terms of revolutionizing all industries. What do you think of Jarvis's argument, and what aspects of Google should we copy? What aspects of the company are indeed iconic?
I love that Jeff Jarvis wrote this book. It's very useful to me. You could read my book as an answer to his in many ways. One of the first things I do in my book is try to puncture the notion of Google as a holy force in the world. And the very notion of his title, "What Would Google Do?" invokes "What would Jesus do?" Right? So, so I was alarmed at the widespread, and Jeff Jarvis is not anywhere close to the only person making this case. The widespread assumption that Google is a force for good in the world, that any company is a force for good in the world, and so I felt it was my duty to answer what I saw as hyperbole in his work. I think his work is really valuable. I think his book provoked a lot of thought in me. I teach it to my students every year. It's a wonderful conversation starter. It's a good first analysis of Google, far from the last. Mine came next, so I hope if you've read Jeff Jarvis's book, you find mine.
Absolutely. I think anyone in the audience who has read Jarvis's book should read yours as well.
Thank you. So yeah, but his book is it's a manifesto that argues that Google can work as a model in all these different areas of life. And I reject almost every one of those cases for a couple of reasons. When we look at how industries work, specificity matters. Specificity of conditions of market players, specificity of what consumers need, the specificity of the transactions within a particular industry. So, lots of people want to write shallow analysis saying something like, well, the publishing industry should do A, B, or C because it should have learned from this other industry doing A, B, and C. Not recognizing that there are legacy regulations from the 1930s that restrict how the publishing industry does what it does and benefits in certain ways. And those aspects of specificity fall out when you get a sort of a smooth analysis of how things might work in this new information age, right? And I think I resist those sort of smooth generalizations about what sort of world we live in. We're in a world of flux. We're in a world in which major players, institutions, habits, and powerful rulemaking institutions are different every 5 years. We weren't thinking about Facebook 5 years ago. 10 years ago, we were just barely thinking about Google. That's a really short time. We're just beginning to figure out what we're doing in terms of our commercial life online and our social life online and our intellectual life online. And so at this very dawn of the conversation, I think it's much more important to avoid pretending that you have the last word on anything.
What is your last word on Google?
My last word on Google is be careful. And by be careful, I mean understand Google. It's a fascinating and brilliant project. It's a deeply important company. It's full of brilliant things, but for all those reasons, we should be wary, right? Think about the automobile. This is a brilliant machine that enhances our lives. We probably wouldn't want to live without it, but we certainly wouldn't want to live without it. We certainly would not want to live with it if it were thoroughly deregulated and if we weren't properly trained to operate it. So I would like us to have those two conversations. How should we learn to work Google better? And how might we build a public infrastructure to ensure that both companies and individuals can thrive over the next 50 years?
Final question. You invested 2 or 3 years of your life in writing a very brilliant, controversial book about Google. Are you more or less worried now, having finished the book, than when you started?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that I'm less worried now than I was 3 years ago, because in the ensuing time, a lot of other people and institutions have started raising hard questions about Google. When I started the work on this book, Google was almost universally worshipped. That's certainly not the case anymore. And so I think a lot of the world is ahead of me with these concerns, and I learned a tremendous amount in the process. So I've never seen Google as an enemy or as necessarily a problem to be solved, but I see it as an opportunity to be managed and ideally optimized in our lives. And so if people pick up the book because they think it might be a tirade against Google, that might help me sell some books. But ultimately, the goal is to provoke serious and critical thought, which might move a smarter person down the line to write a better book, and I think we'd all be better off from that.
Well, it's a great book, essential reading. Shiva, thank you so much.
Appreciate the time.